I'm Andrew Altman from Georgia State University in the United States. I teach in the Department of Philosophy. My expertise is in the area of legal and political philosophy and the 19th century history of philosophy. Going to talk about crimes against humanity, explain what they involve, and what some of the philosophical issues raised by the idea of crimes against humanity are. Crimes against humanity did not exist under the law until after World War II. In the wake of the Nazi atrocities against civilians throughout Europe and Japanese atrocities against civilians in Asia, the international legal system was altered in a very dramatic way. Previously, a state had the sovereignty to do anything with its own people that it chose to do, and international law would not interfere in any way. Okay? This meant that a state could commit atrocities, murders, rapes, forced deportations against its own people, and there would be no crime under international law. If a state did the same thing against foreign populations during a time of war, then those atrocities would count as war crimes. But under international law, as it existed up to 1945, a state was free under the law to treat its own population in whatever way it chose. Germany, as we know, committed horrible atrocities against its own nationals, those members who were Jewish, who were members of labor organizations, who were homosexuals, and who were physically or mentally handicapped. And so after the war, the commission that was set up to prosecute leading figures in the Nazi regime and leading supporters of that regime, that tribunal decided that some of these figures, some of these top officials in the Nazi government would be prosecuted under the charge of crimes against humanity, and that crime was defined in the London Charter of 1945, which established the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. That tribunal put on trial 21 Nazi war criminals and charged many of them with crimes against humanity, including crimes against Jews and the other categories of persons whom I had just mentioned. This was the first time that international law disregarded claims of sovereignty on the part of a state. Under the old system, Germany, the defendants, who were German officials, would have been able to claim that the way they treated their own population was no business of international law. But the London Charter, with its new crime of crimes against humanity, disallowed any such invocation of state sovereignty and instead allowed international law to penetrate through the barrier of state sovereignty and prosecute officials and those who supported those officials in their atrocities against civilian population. The charge of crimes against humanity was somewhat controversial at Nuremberg because it was a new crime in international law, and so some lawyers and legal thinkers argued that a prosecution for crimes against humanity amounted to ex post facto prosecution, that is, a retroactive application of a newly developed criminal law doctrine. But the prosecution at Nuremberg successfully argued that crimes against humanity covered actions that were so egregious, so outrageous from a moral point of view, that any reasonable person would have known that they would make themselves liable to prosecution by perpetrating or being complicit in such actions. And the tribunal agreed with the prosecution, and the leading figures in the Nazi regime were convicted of crimes against humanity. After the International Military Tribunal concluded its deliberations, the international community that was then being formed in the United Nations decided that a special crime should be added to the books of international law, namely the crime of genocide. And shortly after the end of World War II, in 1947-48, a convention prohibiting genocide was written and adopted by the United Nations and subsequently came into force in 1951. Most nations now are signatories to the Convention Against Genocide, and in fact it's regarded by international lawyers that genocide is what's called a customary international crime. That is to say, even if a state has not signed on to the Genocide Convention, the officials and members of that state are still bound by the terms that outlawed genocide, since it has been almost universally regarded that genocide is a crime since the end of World War II. Now, technically speaking, genocide is not the same as a crime against humanity because the provisions for committing genocide are somewhat different, including most notably a special intent requirement. For genocide to occur, the perpetrator must have the specific intention of destroying in whole or in part a certain national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. In contrast, the crime against humanity doesn't require a special intent to destroy in whole or in part a group. Crime against humanity can simply be an attack on a civilian population, and there's no prerequisite of an intention to destroy some group within the population. Nonetheless, most legal thinkers and philosophers regard genocide as the central, as the paradigmatic example of a crime against humanity. And I think this understanding arises from the term crime against humanity itself. Crime against humanity suggests that the crime victimizes not just the direct victims of the atrocity, but rather somehow victimizes all human beings, even if only indirectly. And I think that this term, crime against humanity, was an appropriate one to characterize the Nazi efforts to exterminate the Jewish population of Europe. But I believe it was still metaphorically appropriate and not literally. It was metaphorically appropriate as a term to characterize the Nazi genocide because that genocide was so horrible in its moral dimensions as to be almost beyond human grasp. And so it was a crime of such enormous proportions that it was as if all of humanity were its victim. But of course, literally speaking, the victims did not encompass all of humanity, but rather the specific 6 million or so Jews who were murdered, and less directly their surviving relatives. People in other parts of the earth were not victimized by this awful crime. So literally speaking, I think the Jewish genocide was not a case of a crime against all of humanity, although I think the term was metaphorically appropriate. For a crime against humanity to occur under the law, it's quite possible that only a very limited portion of humanity is victimized. An attack on any civilian population by the military forces of a state will constitute a crime against humanity under current international law and will be subject to prosecution. The question arises as to what court the prosecutions will occur in. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg existed only for a few short years. It was replaced by other military tribunals, which by the mid-1950s had all disbanded, and no international court remained under which criminal prosecutions for crimes against humanity or even genocide could be conducted. This situation lasted until the early 1990s, when genocide and crimes against humanity were committed in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. As a result of those crimes, new tribunals were developed by the United Nations specifically to hear cases arising out of those two historical situations. But again, these tribunals were meant to be just temporary tribunals, and both of them will shortly close shop. It's now the year 2012, and within several years, the tribunals that hear cases arising from former Yugoslavia and Rwanda will close down. In the meantime, though, the International Criminal Court, with over 100 signatory nations, has emerged as the hope for the future in the international prosecution of crimes against humanity and genocide. Currently, there are several cases before the International Criminal Court for these crimes. There are investigations for these crimes being conducted by the prosecutorial office of the International Criminal Court, and the main promise of the future for deterring genocide and crimes against humanity reside, I think, almost entirely with the International Criminal Court. This court has been criticized for having an biased focus on crimes committed in Africa. And this criticism has weakened the perceived legitimacy of the court. However, in my view, these criticisms are misguided. The cases that have come before the court have been, it is true, predominantly from Africa, but that is not because of any bias on the part of the court, but rather because the most egregious instances of genocide and crimes against humanity have been occurring in Africa and in the various failed states of Africa. It's therefore not a matter of bias, but simply a matter of devoting resources to where the worst crimes against humanity are occurring. That explains why the International Criminal Court's docket has been composed mostly of cases arising from episodes that take place in Africa.